We're here in the beautiful Mallorca, and here with Professor Richard Werner, our chairman of Valhalla Network. And Richard, today at the conference, Mallorca Blockchain Days, a lot of people have been asking, considering what's going on at the moment with war, supply shortages, the high inflation, which you predicted many times a long time ago, do you forecast a hard landing or a soft landing?
Well, it looks like the policymakers in key countries are interested in making this very painful. I mean, they're experts in creating boom-bust cycles, and they're doing a good job again. I mean, you know, they ramped up this inflation, and then they wanted to make sure that it's going to be quite painful. So they've been raising interest rates to make it hard for people with mortgages and also for companies and so on. Which is probably unnecessary because really inflation peaked around, well, certainly the last quarter last year. And we know that since then, credit creation, which is the real cause of the inflation of economic activity, has collapsed in a lot of economies, especially in the US.
So these key decision makers, are they the central bankers you speak about?
Yes, sure. Yeah, the central planners.
So talking about these interest rate hikes, do you forecast the Fed and the ECB to continue the hikes, or do you think interest rates are going to start coming down?
I think, to me, it looks like they want to have this narrative out there that, you know, because they need a justification once they have created a significant downturn and recession, potentially of a proportion that could then be used to create a totally unnecessary and unjustified banking crisis. And so I think they want to create this narrative that, oh, it was a mistake. Oh, we raised interest rates too much and, oh, it just happened. Sorry, you know. Well, they won't say sorry, but, you know.
So with what's going on at the moment with the current crisis and everything, they've also got the BRICS now talking about a gold-backed currency. Well, firstly, can you briefly explain what this is? So what is a gold-backed currency? What's the significance of it?
Well, there used to be a gold-backed currency until 1971. The US dollar was backed by gold until those that can convert, at that time could convert dollars into gold, started to do it. And that's when, of course, the US president decided to temporarily suspend the gold conversion, the gold window of the US dollar. And that's been in place for more than half a century now.
But it's temporary. It's temporary.
Yes, and so it's going to come back now, but it looks like it's going to come back with BRICS currencies, not the US dollar. So in that sense, yeah.
So what's the significance of that? Is it the end of the US dollar?
Of course, I mean, it's always nonsense to talk about the end of this currency, the end of that currency. Currencies are mostly political arrangements. And even if economically it's become not viable, it will still exist and still be around if politically, the political decision makers insist on it. So it's not going to be the end of the dollar. The dollar will be around as long as the United States decides and wants to have a dollar. But I think what you're getting at is the dominance, the end of the dominance of the US dollar. And yes, it is a challenge to that dominance. We're already seeing a sort of separation of the trade systems into two trade systems, what some people call a multipolar world. Well, it looks like it's going to be bipolar, first of all. Yeah. And there's of course surrounding Russia and China, and there's certain antagonism that's been going on between the US and Russia and China. And there's many countries that have actually been on the side of China and Russia.
Especially African countries.
Yeah, they've not implemented these sanctions on Russia. And so there's many countries in the world, many developing countries, that actually feel more comfortable now doing deals with Russia and China and the other, Brazil, there's other members of the BRICS group of countries, South Africa. The idea has been put forward to have, they all agree not to use the dollar anymore and to basically dispense with the dollar. And so they've now come forward with the idea that there should be an alternative currency. Now, each country of these countries has a currency. Yeah. The Chinese one is likely the one that's backed by most and sort of trust, because it's also backed by a strong economy and a large economy.
But hasn't Russia been buying a lot of gold recently?
Yes, and so that's the thing. I mean, because they have the decision to discuss, well, should we just use the Chinese currency? China may not be particularly keen on that. There's a certain responsibility that comes with that, having your currency as a sort of main trade currency in the group of countries. But also other countries may feel, well, we don't necessarily want now dominance of China. So if you then say, well, what's the alternative? Well, it could be something neutral. It could be a new currency. But how does that have credibility? Well, that's where the gold comes in. You'd say, well, we have a new currency and it's backed by gold. Many of these countries actually have been accumulating gold reserves. Russia and China in particular, India also, already people have been saying in the recent years, oh, why are they accumulating gold? Maybe there's going to be a gold-backed currency. So it looks like this could happen.
Okay, and on terms of the price of gold, if they've been accumulating all this gold, how is the price not skyrocketed? Is it being held artificially down? Is it being manipulated down?
I think so. Because, yes, so on the one hand, we have a strong demand for gold by certainly the BRICS countries, but also other national entities and central banks buying gold. But also gold is usually a good alternative and an inflation hedge. And so when you have a period of significant inflation, as we've had, you would expect the gold price to go up. And it barely went up. It's been more or less stagnant. It was just a small increase. And I think the main reason there is that it has been suppressed. We know that the central banks have been manipulating the gold price to keep it down for a long time.
How do they do that? How do they manipulate it down?
Yes.
Short sell or?
Well, they on the one hand they're using derivatives, gold derivatives. They're using their market influence. They're using even the fact that you have the London gold price, so a certain city of London.
Yep.
The location. I mean, it used to be one bank in London that fixed that every day. It was called the Gold Fix, and that was what it was called. And people thought, oh, maybe they're fixing the gold. They are. It was called the Gold Fix.
Yeah, they're telling you.
So there's various ways they can do it, but there's a limit to how much they can do it. I think one reason why they've been successful in keeping down the gold price is because they created alternatives such as Bitcoin, which is really an alternative. People call it the sort of digital gold.
Digital gold, yeah.
So a lot of the type of investment that would have gone into gold normally at this stage has actually been diverted to alternative currencies, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and that's taken a bit of pressure off gold. That's been one of the...
We'll come back to Bitcoin shortly. But the US, they've gone to war for their dollar dominance in the past. Or at least, there's allegations of them taking out people who might have been speaking out against it and saying we're not going to support the dollar anymore. This time, what are they doing to protect it? We've got CBDCs now, central bank digital currencies. Is that their answer? We need to protect dollars. We need to have the central bank digital dollar. Is that their answer?
Certainly on the war policy, to some extent that continues, right? I mean, there's war being made by essentially NATO on Russia. Certainly from a Russian viewpoint, that's what it looks like. So there is war against Russia, and Russia is one of the, it looks like one of the backers of a gold-backed alternative to the US dollar. There's certainly, the Americans have been stepping up tension with China, also in the Taiwan Strait, potentially to create a similar situation as with Ukraine and Russia. Taiwan being US-backed, but being very close to China and officially being part of China. Officially, even the US supports the One China policy. So really, what's happening is that the US is backing one part of China against the rest of China, which is kind of strange. I mean, that's quite an intervention in a foreign country, isn't it?
But, well, that's not new for the US, considering the CIA and what they get up to. In your eyes, over the next couple of years, what sectors, what geographies do you think people should be focusing on most?
Well, it depends on who we're talking about and what their outlook is, and ideally you want to know what are the current assets, what do people want to achieve with their investment allocation. But in general, I like gold. Probably also in cryptocurrencies. I mean, I think there's going to be another leg of rises there. Equity markets have been quite strong because of previous money creation in asset markets, and although that I would be a bit more cautious about, because as I said, it looks like the economies are going to slow down, particularly the US economy. So the US stock market looks overvalued, and I would suspect that that's not sustainable. So, US equities perhaps more cautious.
The Werner warning then, the Werner warning. And coming from a man who warned about the Nikkei, the crash, the 2008 as well, and pretty much every market that happens, you've been warning about it or saying this will go up. So the Werner warning there, take it as you wish. So talking about investments then, let's talk about alternative investments. We spoke about Bitcoin earlier. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin? Summary, do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad?
It has both aspects, although I wouldn't really say it's bad, so maybe that's an exaggeration. But on the positive side, I think it's good that there's alternative monetary tools. People should have choice. And it's good to have competition between different monetary instruments. So in that sense, live and let live, it's great that there's more options. I think the history of Bitcoin suggests that it may have been created by the US deep state with a particular purpose. In fact, two purposes. One is the one we've already mentioned, whereby it's a way of getting the gold market, getting pressure off the gold market to keep the gold price down. Should be an alternative outlet for that.
So that's been going decades. So Bitcoin started decades now ago. So you think?
Oh yeah, the gold price has been suppressed
for that long.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So that's one reason. The other reason is central banks had already been planning to introduce their digital control tools, central bank digital currency, and as even recently central bankers have admitted, it's a solution without a problem. So you need some kind of excuse. Well, why are we doing this? Without admitting that actually it's all about control, and surveillance and intervention control. Seize control over people's assets and then have the power to decide whether you can use your money or not. So if you don't want to reveal that, then what's the other rationale? Why are you introducing it? And that's where Bitcoin has been great. I mean, we saw it liberally used by, for example, the head of the European Central Bank when she started her job. It was one of the first things, it's just like, oh, well, there is Bitcoin out there. Well, that proves there's demand for this sort of thing. Well, we as a central bank, we must be offering a digital currency, therefore. And so it's really served the important role as a kind of excuse to justify the introduction of central bank digital currencies.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So if it serves a good purpose like that, you would have to ask questions as to its origin.
Yes. Now, of course, you could say in its defense, okay, that maybe were the origins, but maybe now the tool has actually caught on quite well. And, so I see that and I grant that it could still be playing an important role. And of course, there's alternative currencies, alternative tokens as well.
Of course, yes. And you say it's caught on. You've certainly got some Bitcoin maximalists out there, people calling everyone should be moving their money from the banking system into Bitcoin. They should take it out of the banks. However, not only would this destroy the banking system, which some of them believe is a good thing, obviously we would argue that isn't. Perhaps you can explain why that isn't a good thing and why economic growth would no longer exist. In fact, why would it get degrowth? Nations would start getting degrowth, we'd start fighting financial collapse, bankruptcies. Why would that happen?
Yes, well, what is economic growth? It means that we have more transactions this year than last year, and that's only possible if more money is used for transactions this year than last year. And that, because money is usually engaged in something, means you need to add to the money supply. Certainly with the current system that we have, the only way that is done is through banks. Banks, commercial banks or central banks, creating new money with banks, which is the majority of money creation through lending, the process of lending. That's how banks create money. With a loan, new money is put into circulation. So then you have more purchasing power that's being used. You will therefore have more transactions and you have economic growth. If you don't have that, there won't be economic growth. It will be a zero-sum game, which is not impossible, but it does mean things get more competitive. And also it does mean when you're an entrepreneur, you have a new idea, ways to improve productivity, a new product you want to bring to the market, you can't lay claim on existing finite resources to implement that, because credit creation, money creation is a societal organizational tool, and you don't have that available. So that means that it will be basically harder to demonstrate improvements, because for every claim you make on resources, there has to be a reduction in other claims on resources. So then it's a zero-sum game, you see.
Okay, that makes sense. So we talked about other currencies, Ethereum. Now, Ethereum is the other big one, and that's what we're building on with Valhalla Network. Perhaps as chairman of Valhalla Network, can you sum it up in 30 seconds what our mission is with Valhalla Network and how we're trying to achieve it?
Yes. Well, Valhalla Network, the way I see it is, on the one hand, there's a DAO, there's a token. It is a network that has the usual features that we have with cryptocurrencies. And it can be an alternative for people to hold their purchasing power and express their purchasing power, and also have some kind of decision-making power in the DAO. But really the core and special feature and unique feature is that it's doing what I think is very important and is necessary, is linking the cryptocurrency world, digital currency world, to the banking world in a new way, by saying, well, we constantly need to create new small banks, new local banks. This is one of the things I've found in my research, is that because banks, they're also economic agents. I mean, banking is actually very profitable activity, but as a result of the features of banking, banks tend to grow, whether it's organic growth, because they're doing well and they're expanding, or otherwise. And as banks get bigger, they lend less to small firms. But really, the small firms are the core of the economy. They account for 2/3 or more of employment.
Okay.
And also, when small firms get money, that has a bigger impact. It has a multiplier impact, if you want, because they will employ more people. That's where job creation is. That's where prosperity is. And that's also where productivity is. We won't have time to go into detail, but essentially countries that have many small banks, they tend to be more productive than countries that have a very concentrated banking system. Now, the link is this. The Valhalla Network wants to create many local banks, and thereby linking the two worlds, the token world and the community banking world. And that opens many other avenues and options, because the community banks are great general tools for organizing communities, supporting communities, getting growth and wealth creation in communities, but also, of course, they can be on-off ramps for cryptocurrencies. And also, if circumstances change and you need to launch a new particular local currency, they can also act as centers for that, because there are ledgers. It can be gold-based, local currencies, all sorts.
Yeah. Okay, that wasn't quite 30 seconds, but...
How many seconds was that?
I'm not sure, but...
Didn't you say 300 seconds?
I might have. So, in terms of the two communities, so the way I see it is we're trying to link the power of banking with the ethos of the decentralized governance, the ethos of DAOs and Web3. Really.
Isn't that what I said?
Basically, yes. But why is it now a good time to be setting up banks? Like, in this current environment, it seems that when interest rates are high, more entrepreneurs are more interested in setting up banks. Why is that?
Of course, banks are more profitable. And therefore, your return on equity is going to be higher. It's now an ideal time to set up new banks. And emphasis on new, because at the same time, you will have seen there's some worries about existing banks in the US, sort of regional banks. Are they in trouble or whatever? And what's happened there is that, of course, if you've got existing assets, then interest rate rises create nominal potential losses that fortunately banks don't have to realize, except if there's unusual circumstances, as seem to have happened with Silicon Valley Bank and others, which is another story. But basically, when you set up a new bank, you just don't have that legacy, you don't have that history, you get straight benefit from the high interest rates.
Okay, that makes sense. So would you say now is a prime time then for Valhalla Network to at least be launching, trying to set up these community banks?
Absolutely,
so I feel like with what's on the horizon with CBDCs and what central planners are trying to do, we're sort of the other side, which is that we need to take a stand against this, and this is the best opportunity.
And that's of course the other reason. And I was going to say, it's not just that we should establish community banks. I think really we have to establish community banks because that's the best defense there is against the introduction of CBDCs. Because then we can also argue, and then you would have local constituents really supporting this. We need to defend community banks against the threat from CBDCs, and CBDCs should be introduced because then the costs will be higher of introducing CBDCs. The more you have community banks, the higher the costs of introducing CBDCs. And of course, they're control tools, so it's good to increase that cost and then also political support for the alternative, the decentralized money creation.
Of course, we'll take a look at the truckers in Canada and how the lack of the decentralized banking structure there, it was very centralized. Very easy for the central planners to orchestrate the freezing of accounts, the freezing of money, stopping people using it. Whereas if you've got a very decentralized banking system like Germany, to try and orchestrate it, then you have to speak to many more banks, try to tell them all what to do, and then the banks might start saying, hold on, no, we don't agree with this, we need to ask you questions. It's much harder to try and roll out that with a decentralized system. So of course the central planners like a centralized system. One thing I hear often when I speak to people about community banks, and particularly the Sparkassen, and I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly.
That's fine.
Is they're not profitable. That's what I hear a lot. They're not making much money, or they're not as profitable. They're struggling. I hear struggling a lot. Is that true?
All banks struggled when the ECB lowered interest rates to zero and to negative territory because that really squeezes bank margins. And then secondly, since 2008, the small local community banks were made to pay for the 2008 crisis created by the big banks because they introduced massive regulation that, in a way, maybe you could justify it for the big banks, but they introduced it for all banks, including the community banks. For them, that's often, hiring one or two more compliance officers or report writing officers is essentially impossible because they're very tight ships. It means they have to give up. They have to merge with another community bank. So that pressure was created. That's true as well. But in general, they have been profitable. In fact, even despite the squeeze, they've continued to be profitable. One reason, of course, is because they had decades of essentially hidden gains. They could mark up, all sorts of assets. They could gradually mark up, and that's one way they managed to survive this 15-year squeeze arranged by the ECB. So they have actually been profitable, but also in many ways. Look at the big banks. Isn't it a good thing if banks are not that profitable? I mean, the fact is they have high return on equity.
Yes.
Between 15 and 25%. I mean, isn't that enough? I mean, why do you have to be more profitable? That means they're taking more out of the economy,
Of course.
But of course, the community banks, they've always been putting, the profits that they have, what do? They pay taxes. Whereas if you have these big banks, they usually have international offshore structures and their tax payments are much smaller. Secondly, the German Sparkassen savings banks, they directly put their profits back by supporting all these local charities, sports, theatre, arts. Their sponsors, the big sponsors supporting all that.
And that's what we're going to do at Valhalla Network as well. Every single community bank that Valhalla Network sets up, 25% is owned by a local charity foundation with local leaders getting involved that then reinvest and decide how to reinvest them back into local community initiatives. And 75% is owned by the foundation itself that's been governed by the DAO. So we're taking that Sparkassen and then trying to effectively make it one step better by having decentralized governance. Okay. Last question, Richard, because I appreciate the time. For economic students out there, people who are looking at studying economics right now, they're being maybe pushed into mainstream economics, maybe still neoclassical. What is your advice to interested students out there that are trying to learn the truth about economics?
Well, think critically is one thing. So whenever you read something about economics, you have to evaluate it very critically. And of course, it helps if you've had a bit of training, read some of my work perhaps, or come to my lectures at the University of Winchester. There's another master's course we're now starting probably from actually this year, October. And also we're having for students an Oxford program in the first week of September. So get in touch, write to me at professorwerner.org. The website has my email address if you want to sign up. It's, at Oxford, at an Oxford college, you get a proper University of Oxford library card, and there's a full program. So, we're introducing proper economics teaching based on reality and the scientific research methodology.
And I said it was the last question, but I actually just remembered one more that someone asked me to ask you. Have you ever, consider you've been in banking now for 30 odd years, maybe a bit longer now, with all your research you're doing as well in your late teens. The work you're doing is, and what you're revealing to people is against a lot of what the central planners are looking at. Have you ever been bribed?
No is the answer. Perhaps it was slightly disappointing. Perhaps they should be trying to bribe me, and then I could answer, well, they tried, but I said no. Certainly in monetary terms, it hasn't happened. I guess there were other attempts. You get, this is a slightly more indirect version. You get invited. I was invited to the World Economic Forum,
Well, you were a young leader at one point.
Global leader for tomorrow. And of course, I guess the deal is, if you are well-behaved, and I was invited officially for 5 years, and I attended twice. It's once a year, in January. And after the second time I attended, they abolished the entire program and then but then re-established a new program in 2004, which they called Young Global Leader Program. And then they were more selective and I wasn't invited. And I guess I didn't behave, so I didn't play the game. I didn't accept the bribe. It is very exciting to be there. You meet personally, at the time, President Clinton, all the leaders are there. I met Angela Merkel, even before she was Chancellor, and all sorts of people, Peter Gabriel, pop music star, all sorts, And it's easy to think, I better, be nice here and make sure they invite me again. But basically, there were serious debates, and they were saying things that are not true, and I had to speak up.
Well, I've seen you speaking up at the debates today, and I can certainly say he's not one shy for words. I can say that. Okay. Excellent. So, if you are actually interested in bribing Richard or trying to bribe Richard, you can offer him your bribes by writing to him at Oliver@valhallanetwork.io.